When new scientific evidence emerged, would one of Australia's most infamous child murderers have her sentence overturned? This is the Kathleen Folbigg story. Hi, Amy.
Hi, finally, this case.
Yes, okay. So I'm glad you said that. This is my second international case, and I am pleased to finally cover this story. Now, why do you say finally?
It's been, I would say, one of the top 3 cases suggested.
But also, it was requested by one of our very special listeners who's been our supporter for quite some time now. I'd say from the beginning.
I think she might have been within the first, 20 patrons.
No, yeah, absolutely. So I want to give a big shout out to Siobhhann, who no matter what the time is, by the way, in Australia, almost never misses one of our Zoom meetups.
Yep. She's usually working with test tubes.
Yes, exactly. But she's always there. She has provided us with a lot of insight as well on the Australian system. So, I mean, she gives us insights on what's like the legal workings, the inner workings, I should say. She suggested cases. And
told me about the Taylor Swift concert in Australia.
That's right. Oh my gosh, she is helpful on every level. And this is one case that she has consistently requested since the beginning, since her affiliation. So thank you, Siobhhann, for your suggestion, for your assistance, and of course for your patience in waiting for us to finally cover this very important story. I'm glad we waited, though, I have to say, because there's been some big developments in this case in the last year or so, and I would have really hated to cover it before capturing some of this. And before I accidentally give a spoiler, which I'm about to do, let me introduce you to the subject of today's story. Kathleen Meghan Folbigg was born in New South Wales, Australia in 1967. But her early life was not an easy one. Her father was a known violent offender. He was an enforcer for other criminal enterprises, and he had also stabbed his first wife.
Did his second wife know about that?
I'm not sure if she knew, but I can tell you that when Kathleen was just 3 years old, her father stabbed her mother 24 times and killed her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't see that coming either. I had no idea about her background before I began this. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and deported to England afterwards, leaving Kathleen to be placed in foster care. Talk about a rough beginning, huh?
Yeah.
She moved around a lot between relatives until her ultimate home with foster parents in the city of Newcastle. I'm not sure why, but they never formally adopted her, but they fostered her for years, and she resided with them, knowing them as her parents.
And by all accounts, this was a loving family?
No. So despite the stability that her situation provided, Kathleen found her foster mother overly controlling, and both of her foster parents utilized what we might call corporal punishment as discipline at times. She tried to spend as little time at home as Kathleen's best school friend Tracy said. She said that Kathleen always wanted to stay at her house, and she would even show up when Tracy wasn't there and just hang out with her parents. And other friends of Kathleen's also said that she would stay over with them a lot, and she really didn't like being at home with either of her foster parents.
I wonder why nobody alerted authorities that she was being abused.
So
I think it was the time.
It's definitely the time. And so I want to say very clearly that I'm not sure exactly what level of punishment they employed. There is a line, as we know, between abuse and discipline, I guess. And I'm not sure where that fell with Kathleen. I do know that she felt that she was definitely over-controlled. And I think I would argue she probably felt that she was abused. I'm just not sure exactly where the line was in their home. So I don't want to state that with clarity. Regardless, Kathleen was not happy living at home. By the time she was around 16 or 17, Kathleen decided that she wanted to quit school and work, to which her parents said absolutely not, and that if she made that choice, she would have to live on her own. So, not enjoying her life at home, it was an easier decision for Kathleen, and she spent the next several months living with a friend while she worked for a restaurant. So she got a job right away. During this time, Kathleen also began to date a man named Craig Folbigg. At 24, Craig was 6 years older than Kathleen, but she was immediately smitten with him. He had a good job, and he was very good to Kathleen by all accounts. The pair quickly moved in together, got engaged in 1986, and married in 1987. Soon after, Kathleen became pregnant, and she and Craig were elated about starting their family. They joyfully welcomed their first child, Caleb, in February of 1989. But this joy was short-lived because Caleb only lived to be 19 days old. Kathleen found her baby deceased in his crib with no apparent cause of death obvious, and because of that, his death was ruled as a SIDS case. I kind of want to just point out here, most people have heard of SIDS at this point, sudden infant death syndrome. This is just an umbrella category when infants die and there's no apparent cause of death.
This must have been a tough case for you, being that you have an infant.
You know, I have to tell you, this case was tremendous. I was going to save it for the end, but tremendously difficult for me to cover and for me to get through. Important, very important, but so much harder than I could have imagined at the beginning. And this was harrowing for the couple. But not long after, Kathleen became pregnant with their second child, Patrick, who she gave birth to in June of 1990. Things seemed to be going well until Patrick was around 4 months old. Kathleen found him not breathing, and Craig had to perform CPR on him. Now, while Craig was able to revive his son, Patrick sustained brain damage that led to a seizure disorder. And unfortunately, Amy, when Patrick was just 8 months old, he took a nap and he did not wake up.
I'm assuming they did an autopsy to try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, the pathologist ruled Patrick's death was due to airway obstruction from an epileptic fit. And this would have resulted from the disorder that he had at 4 months old.
Did the newborn have this disorder, or there's no way to know?
They never have known the cause of her first child, Caleb's death.
This is an extremely rare occurrence to lose a child, but to lose a newborn and then an infant, this is...
Yeah. It's another awful tragedy for this poor couple. I mean, it would be a tragedy for any couple. For Kathleen and her husband, Craig, 18 months later, in the fall of 1993, Kathleen gave birth to their third child. And this would be a daughter named Sarah. Sarah was a very smiley baby. You know, I always like to look at the pictures, of course. And you could just see this in her photos. I know a lot of babies are happy, and I know mine is, but she really did look so happy. But shockingly, when Sarah was 10 months old, she also went to sleep and never woke up from a nap.
What?
Yes. Everyone was shocked.
What did the pathologist find here?
Well, there was no apparent cause of death. Again, the case was ruled death due to SIDS. Again, a catch-all category when they really can't figure out what happened. And the question really became, what was going on with these children?
What age does SIDS go up to? Is it like 1 year?
1. I mean, the odds decrease substantially as you get past, I think it's 6 months, and the odds decrease with every month. But it is a possibility up to 1, and possibly even a little bit longer than 1, but it becomes substantially less likely. I mean, I can't imagine the tragedy of losing 3 children. But I will say that Kathleen and Craig decided Kathleen and Craig had a 4th child and final child 3 years later in 1998. And this was a little girl they named Laura. Laura was incredibly happy and healthy. And when she celebrated her first birthday, Kathleen and Craig believed they'd finally have a child who would grow up. But much to everyone's shock, in March of 1999, when Laura was 19 months old, she also died in her sleep.
What?
Yeah, 19 months. I mean, they're all shocking, but this one, I think, especially shocked everyone because, again, they thought at 19 months old they'd cleared the big hurdles.
Did Kathleen find the children? Craig? Both? Who discovered the children?
It was Kathleen. I should point out, though, that Kathleen was always she was a stay-at-home mom, and Craig worked. So I would like to point out that Kathleen found them, and it was always during a nap.
Was Craig ever suspicious of anything? It sounds like they stayed together, but
no, they stayed together. However, as you can imagine, Amy, the strain of losing 4 children deteriorates a relationship. Though Kathleen would later reveal that their relationship had begun to crack while the children were alive. So I'd imagine through every death, there's got to be more pain and more cracks in the foundation. Kathleen felt that there was also an enormous pressure and stress on her as she tried to please Craig and care for each child. But I think that it was Laura's death that truly broke the couple. And after Laura's death, the pair separated, with Kathleen leaving the home. When she did, Craig found that Kathleen had left her diary behind. And Craig read it, and some of the entries terrified him, to the point that he went to the police, citing that he believed Kathleen had murdered their children.
Oh, well, okay. You're going to get to what these diaries say.
I'm gonna get there right now. Obviously, I cannot read the whole diary, but I'm gonna read you some significant excerpts here, ones that would become critical later, okay? Let's start here. I feel like the worst mother on this earth, scared that Laura will leave me now, like Sarah did. I know I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her, and she left with a bit of help. A second entry. It can't happen again. I'm ashamed of myself. I can't tell my husband about it because he'll worry about leaving her with me. Another entry. My guilt of how responsible I feel for them all haunts me. And elsewhere, what sort of mother have I been? A terrible one. That's what it boils down to. Another one. Craig was pretty drunk Friday night. In his drunken stupor, he admitted that he's not really happy. There's a problem with his security level with me. He has a morbid fear about Laura. Well, I know there's nothing wrong with her, nothing out of the ordinary anyway, because it was me, not them. Think I handle her fits of crying better than I did with Sarah. I've learned to, once getting to me, to walk away and breathe in for a while myself. It helps me cope and figure out how to help her. With Sarah, all I wanted was her to shut up, and one day she did. Last entry I'll read here. She's a fairly good-natured baby. Thank goodness, it has saved her from the fate of her siblings. I think she was warned.
Okay, to me, the last one is the most problematic.
Yes. I mean, to me, they read like someone who's a normal mother struggling to cope, and in some cases not normal because you've lost so many children. Of course you're going to be scared all the time. Yeah. I also want to point out, this is going to become an issue later on, but I think every mother feels guilt if anything goes wrong with their children. Even when I was pregnant and I had struggles with my pregnancy, I felt guilty. I thought it was my fault.
Of course.
I think there's just a level of blame that every mother would feel. And if you had children that died inexplicably.
Yeah. Also, we have to recognize, though, that we're reading these through a totally different lens.
We are, yes.
So if we were reading these through the lens of people who were investigating this case, right? Think of confirmation bias. You do what you look at the evidence through whatever lens you think a story goes.
So let's get to Laura's autopsy, because it showed that she had an issue with her heart. Specifically, it was myocarditis, or inflammation of the heart. However, the medical examiner did not believe this caused her death. He was suspicious, he said, because of the other deaths in the Folbigg family. And so he ruled the cause of death as undetermined, which really ignited the police investigation and the focus on Kathleen.
So had that autopsy been done in a vacuum, he wouldn't have said undetermined?
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Yes, exactly. And later on, he would go on to say that while there were no signs of smothering per se, you can't always detect that. So, between the autopsy and the diaries, the police felt that they had enough for an arrest. And in 2001, 2 years after Laura's death, Kathleen Folbigg was arrested for murdering her children.
What about the autopsy? You said between the autopsies and her diaries. What did the autopsies show that were indicative of foul play?
None. There was nothing. It was Laura's autopsy in which the medical examiner noted concerns and ruled the death undetermined.
Gotcha.
Remember, the other ones, 2 were ruled SIDS, and the other one was ruled as an epileptic fit that was due to a seizure disorder. So Kathleen, the nation eagerly awaited the trial of child killer Kathleen Folbigg, which began in 2003. The prosecution alleged that Kathleen had smothered all of her children to death out of frustration with them. And the key evidence to support their assertions at trial included the following. First, Craig Folbigg testified against his wife, stating that, among other things, she struggled with motherhood and stress over parenting, and that she could lose her temper with her children. The pathologist who conducted Laura's autopsy concluded that it was undetermined, though again, this was not due to any particular evidence, but more because of the influence of what we call Meadows Law. Have you ever heard of Meadows Law?
No.
I had not either. Attributed to British pediatrician Roy Meadows, who said the following: 1 sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder until proven otherwise.
Oh. Oh, wow.
Yes. And 3 of Kathleen's children had died inexplicably, with one having noted a medical natural cause.
Was there ever a second opinion on Laura's?
There would be later, but not at the time. We're going to talk more about Meadows Law a little bit later. I just want to let you know that, but I want you to keep that in mind. And then there were really just Kathleen's own words. Probably the most damning of all the evidence were the diary entries I read earlier. Kathleen also wrote about, just to give you some idea, she wrote about how she wished she could go to the gym more and stay in better shape, how she wished Craig would help more around the house, how she wished she could go out with friends and be more social.
Sounds like a typical mother's complaints, no?
Again, it read as typical to me, those entries, but the prosecution said that her children got in the way of her life. They stressed her to the point where she killed them. The prosecution also argued that they weren't sure if Kathleen necessarily meant to kill them. Perhaps she just meant to silence them because she got so frustrated with them. Either way, it resulted in their murder. While the prosecution never presented one bit of direct evidence to point to Kathleen's guilt, the damage was done. And without Kathleen's testimony, the jury believed the prosecution's narrative. Kathleen Folbigg was found guilty on all counts. She buckled over in pain when the verdict was read, and according to some reports, let out what could only be described as a guttural cry. Kathleen was sentenced to 40 years in prison with a non-parole period of 25 years.
That's actually a pretty light sentence.
It's pretty light because we compare it to the United States, right? And here that would have been an automatic life sentence, if not a possible death penalty case. As most defendants do, Kathleen appealed, and while her sentence was reduced to 30 years, her conviction stood. Her case was somewhat quiet until 2011, when an academic named Emma Cunliffe wrote a book titled Murder, Medicine, and Motherhood, which detailed how unexplained infant deaths have morphed into wrongful convictions of their mothers in many unfortunate cases.
We've covered some.
We have, and in fact, don't worry, I've saved that as well. But yes, we have covered quite a few of them. Cunliffe used Kathleen's case as the focus of her book, as well as detailing the problem between the legal process and scientific evidence in the courts, referencing other cases that should have informed the Folbigg court.
So she believed that Kathleen was innocent, or she just thought that it's an unknown? Or what was her take?
I think the take was that there really wasn't evidence to show that Kathleen was guilty, and that science doesn't always inform the courts. And so I think it was, I don't know that she was outright advocating for Kathleen's innocence. I did not read the book, just so you know. But I think she was certainly showing, or certainly meant to show, that in cases where there are unexplained deaths, the mothers are blamed and they can result in wrongful convictions. And I think she thought that this was a case where that was possible. So that was in 2011. Then in 2013, the University of Newcastle Legal Center, part of the wider University of Newcastle School of Law and Justice, reopened Kathleen's case with serious questions about the integrity of the evidence, or lack of it, that was used to convict her. And I think that was the point of Cunliffe's book as well. Where's the evidence in these convictions? The Legal Center is well known for bringing students together with attorneys to take on high-profile cases with a public interest, which is one of the reasons Kathleen's case was selected.
So it's similar to an Innocence Project, it sounds like.
Absolutely, yeah. In 2015, they petitioned the governor for a judicial review of Kathleen's case. And though it took 3 years, or a little bit longer, in 2019, Kathleen was granted an inquiry to look into the medical evidence in the case and the diary evidence. This is the evidence that convicted her, and Craig's words. So the 3 critical pieces of evidence.
I mean, it seems like the diary's the diary. What else are they going to find? Like it seems like, yes, the medical evidence is going to be paramount here, but what's the diary going to do? We could look at it through a different lens, but words are words.
Well, maybe that's what they were looking through, a different lens or an
Hmm.
analysis of the words. As we know, linguistics is quite a hot field now.
Hmm.
But let me first say that in New South Wales, judicial inquiries are a special way to have a potential wrongful conviction reviewed. And they're usually held at the behest of the governor or the attorney general or via a direct application. In this type of inquiry, the presiding judge hears evidence, testimony, and gathers other information to render a decision about whether the case should be sent back to the Court of Appeals for a review of the conviction and sentence. And during this inquiry, Kathleen would testify about her diary entries and what they meant. So that was the point in part 2. Nobody heard from Kathleen to describe what she actually meant. No one was able to question her. And when you said, that someone died, one of your babies died with a little bit of help, what does that actually mean? Though the prosecution constantly suggested that her diary entries were written by a guilty woman who killed her children, Kathleen consistently held that they were the writings of a woman who was sad and blamed herself for her children's death. But not because she had a hand in killing them, because she was their mother, she was responsible, and she could never figure out why they kept dying. As the inquiry progressed, Kathleen's her team had genetic testing run utilizing Kathleen's DNA. And what they found was shocking. The Folbigg daughters, Sarah and Laura, shared a rare genetic mutation that caused heart complications. Let me explain just a little bit here without getting too deep into the science. Comodulin is a protein that is essential to regulating the rhythm of the heartbeat, which means that the mutation of this gene can cause the heart to stop suddenly. So just take that in. This gene mutation that they had, very, very rare in the population, that was not detected before and could not have been without further testing, causes the heart to stop.
Okay, but that's something they could test for now. Like they could exhume the bodies.
Well, they did test for this now, but this wouldn't be necessarily part of a standard autopsy.
Oh.
This was using Kathleen's DNA. This is deep DNA analysis. And though not found until later, I also want to point out the same scientific team to reveal this mutation found that Folbigg, the boys, had a genetic mutation linked to epilepsy, which had been, if you recall, identified in the second son, Patrick.
So they had 2 totally separate gene mutations, this family.
That's correct.
Wow. How rare. That must be, the rarity of that is...
Very rare, yes. Even with the new information, the scientific information, this would be later that they would find out about the mutation related to the boys. But I still don't think that they could ascribe a cause of death to her first son, Caleb, who did die within 19 days. And I'd like to point out, it is totally possible that it was a case of SIDS and that there was some inexplicable explanation. Or, some people might think at this point, it's still possible that Kathleen murdered her children. But more importantly, what would the genetic evidence and Kathleen's explanations of her diary entries do in this inquiry? Would they be enough to sway the judge? The science was that was a pretty strong development, everyone felt. In the end, this new information would not sway the presiding judge.
Oh.
He did not find the genetic explanation strong enough, or her explanations of her diary strong enough to alter the original decision. So Kathleen's conviction stood. I believe the judge said it's possible they had genetic mutations, but it's possible that had nothing to do with their deaths as well.
Which is true.
And also, like I said, it wasn't discovered until after the inquiry about the boys. So I think the judge is saying there's still 2 other children that there's no explanation. So would this be the end of her legal battle?
No.
It wasn't over quite yet. Kathleen's team found support among the scientific community, who were appalled that the court had not taken these genetic explanations seriously. With almost 100 leading experts in the country and around the world supporting these findings and signing a petition that argued for Kathleen's pardon, the New South Wales Attorney General called for a second inquiry into the case. So very rare legal proceedings that are happening here as well. This inquiry took place in 2022, and many from the scientific community were present to testify about the genetic mutations that led to the Folbigg daughters' deaths. People flew in from other countries to be at this inquiry because they felt so strongly. I also want to point out that while this petition had almost 100 signatures, by the time they were done, it had about 150. So there was very strong support from very reputable people in the scientific field.
Was there similarly a group of people who were fighting to keep her in prison?
No, not that I could find. There was not.
Because usually you have that.
Yes. And there may have been a group, but I could not find it a significantly publicized group, except for the prosecution, the Crown. This second inquiry took place in 2022. And like I said, there were many people there to testify. Kathleen's legal team also worked very hard to dispel the Meadows Law influence from their first trial that, insisted children from one family could not all die of natural causes.
That's not scientific, right? It's just anecdotal, if you can even call it that.
I'll explain what this means, because it was a pediatrician who found this, and he gave a statistical analysis that I'm going to cover in 1 second. But I want to say that Kathleen's team uncovered cases where families had multiple children die due to natural causes, that this was possible, of course. 2 of these cases were Sally Clark and Angela Canning's, and expert Dr. Roy Meadows had testified in both of these cases, where both of these women were convicted. Here's what happened, though. The statistical odds of death that he gave on the stand were completely unsubstantiated. Here's what he claimed. That the chances of a SIDS death in an affluent family of non-smokers like Sally Clark's family was 1 in 8,543. Now, I don't know where the original number came from, but I think he had a basis for the original one. But get this. Then he squared this number to conclude that the chances of 2 SIDS deaths in one family would be 1 in 73 million.
It's not how it works.
No, there are many problems with these estimates.
You can't do that.
I mean, the most problematic here, you can't assume that SIDS cases are statistically independent of one another, which is what led to this overinflated estimation. Yeah, that is not how it works. And I will tell you, Meadows would later be discredited by the court, temporarily stripped of his medical license, and found responsible for several wrongful convictions.
Oh.
And while he didn't testify directly in Kathleen's case, prosecutors used his discredited logic to indict Kathleen. And it was the philosophy the pathologist was also following, could not figure out how 4 kids in one family could possibly die. All right, so he's discredited. There's more scientific support for the genetic mutation that led to the girls' deaths. And additionally, in this inquiry, they also had psychologists and psychiatrists, among other linguistic experts, to testify about Kathleen's diary entries. These experts got up and testified that these were likely the expression of a woman who was experiencing deep grief and blamed herself rather than a confession of guilt.
I mean,
Now,
that's totally subjective.
I think that's subjective as well. I'm going to agree with you.
Even on both sides.
Yes, I think it's subjective as well. I don't think on its own the testimony about the diary entries would be enough. However, I don't think the evidence of the diary entries was ever truly evidence in a criminal case from the beginning. In the end, with all of these new developments, would this be enough to help Kathleen? The answer is yes, it would. At the end of the second inquiry, the New South Wales Attorney General Michael Daly announced that there was reasonable doubt about Kathleen's convictions, and as such, the governor was granting her an official pardon.
When was that?
Her inquiry happened in 2022, so several months later, 2023. At this point, all parties agreed that the new evidence suggested reasonable doubt and that Kathleen should be released unconditionally.
Wow.
On June 5th, 2023, 56-year-old Kathleen Folbigg walked out of prison a free woman.
I'm dying to know the court of public opinion.
A lot of support for Kathleen.
Really?
And this would make a very interesting case for my media and crime class, the way media shapes opinions, because in the beginning, She was viewed as, she was labeled monster mother, worst serial killer. But I do think the court of public opinion changed drastically and was much more sympathetic.
I'm wondering also, did Craig change his tune? Was he more supportive?
Craig never changed his tune. He always believes that Kathleen was guilty.
Meghan, I'm pretty surprised about the public sentiment because those diary entries are pretty damning. And it doesn't sound like the scientific evidence was 100% certain that, right? Unless I'm misunderstanding. Was there 100% scientific certainty that these child all had a genetic disorder and that's why they died?
No, it was pretty certain about the two daughters, undoubtedly. And I want to say that I'm not sure the public was entirely with her, but I did get the impression from what I saw that there was widespread support of this being a wrongful conviction.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, I thought so. Let me actually tell you what happened afterwards. While she only had the clothes on her back to start her life over, Kathleen's childhood friend Tracy was waiting for her on the day of her release. I think I referenced Tracy in the very beginning, but I'll just let you know that Tracy had been one of Kathleen's biggest advocates throughout her trial and incarceration. She had always been support for Kathleen. I've heard her on several podcasts because I listen to other podcasts as well about this case. And what I think is just so incredible and lovely is that Tracy and her family built Kathleen an apartment on their property for Kathleen to reside in afterwards.
I would do that for you.
I would totally do that for you.
That is really nice.
It was really nice.
Kathleen had somewhere to go, which is good.
She had the support of a couple of her friends, but Tracy, I mean, I heard Tracy on the podcast I'll reference at the end, and I mean, she sounded like really an incredible support system. Now, Kathleen will never get over the loss of her children. There is no getting over that. And she had to wait 20 years to be able to properly grieve them in her own way and, in private. But that's unfortunately not the only trauma she had to endure. Kathleen was also, I just want to point out, she was also assaulted very badly in 2021 after a prison transfer. Because, as you know, mothers who have been convicted of murdering their children are not welcome. She did recover, but she was injured very badly. Despite this attack and all the others on her over the years, and I don't mean the physical attacks, I mean the attacks on her character, Kathleen has showed incredible grace upon her release, saying that she was grateful and humbled by her pardon, and that she would always grieve for and miss her children. She's expected to seek financial compensation and I would say likely to receive it, but that remains to be seen at this point. In the case of her ex-husband, who you asked about, Craig unfortunately always believed that Kathleen was guilty. Craig remarried and had a child with his second wife. He later, however, suffered with cancer and quite recently died from a sudden heart attack. Both Kathleen and Craig experienced the kind of loss that no one should have to. As we know, there's no worse thing. And though there is blame to place somewhere, I certainly don't place it on either of them. That would be my opinion. However, who is to blame then? How do we wrap our heads around what happened here? I think this probably requires us to take a look at the system and have a discussion of no crime wrongful convictions, which I know you're familiar with.
Yes, we even had an expert on. Our friend Jessica Henry came on to talk about no crime wrongful convictions. That was probably a couple of years ago at this point.
I think it's been a couple of years since we spoke with Jess. Now, in your traditional wrongful conviction cases, it's usually that someone other than the convicted person committed the crime. So DNA can be very helpful. But in a no crime conviction case, a crime never occurred, which makes these cases very tricky. According to recent research, at least 1/3 of all wrongful convictions are in situations where no crime occurred at all. That is such a staggering number. That number, I know it, but it still shocked me.
And the majority of those cases are people who have been accused of killing a loved one, most often a child or sometimes a spouse or another, someone who's a caretaker of some way.
But why does it happen? We have covered a number of systemic explanations, but at the most simple level, I think it's hard to believe that a senseless act could be the result of something natural. We have a very hard time believing, especially that a child or any person can die without an explanation.
Yeah, because then we're all scared
It's
We
true.
can't wrap our heads around that.
That's very, very true. And I would like to also point out that in another one of our podcasts, Direct Appeal, we uncovered that it's not just SIDS, but SADS, sudden adult death syndrome. There's a couple cases of SADS that happen, a couple thousand cases of SADS that happen as well. And those cases, you know, a spouse or someone might come up for a possible wrongful conviction. Now, we covered a couple of these cases. Amy, you covered Patricia Stallings, correct?
Yeah, Patricia Stallings, her second son being born is what kind of exonerated her because he got sick. Luckily, he never died, but because he was ill, I guess they did some genetic testing and they were able to connect the fact that the same genetic issue that he had, his younger brother who died, had as well. And she was exonerated.
It was his birth that certainly revealed the genetic cause. And she was eventually exonerated. I referenced Sally Clark before. This was a case that this was also a case in which Dr. Roy Meadows testified against.
Did we didn't cover that case?
No,
though, right?
no. I just referenced it earlier.
Yeah.
So she also had 2 children that died from natural causes, but it was later shown that evidence of one child's bacterial blood infection was withheld. So this is also a bad faith action. But also when you coupled that with Meadows' testimony, Clark was wrongfully convicted. She was later exonerated, but tragically died of alcohol poisoning, with many saying that she never recovered from the deaths of her children and her incarceration.
Yeah.
But how do you recover that? I guess we should really turn to, at the end of this episode now, what we can do to prevent these tragedies. Because you have the initial tragedy, which is compounded by wrongfully convicted those who are already victims. It's so much worse. But there are things we can do to reform the system.
Yes.
In both the U.S. and, of course, Australia, where this case took place. One of the suggestions here is to look at using exoneration units, which are a fairly new development in the United States. Right, Amy?
What do you mean by exoneration
Sorry,
units?
exoneration units in prosecutor's office.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're called conviction integrity units or conviction review units.
Yes.
But that's also after the fact. That's not preventative.
No. However, it's something that we put in place to later review cases in which there's serious questions about the guilt.
Correct.
So I think that's an important part of a prosecutor's unit. Even though it's after, it's also a way to look at justice differently. So we always tend to measure justice in terms of convictions, but we should be measuring it in terms of exoneration as well, or not convicting people who are innocent. So yes, the fresh evidence standards of appeals in Australia allows for scientific developments not available previously to be considered. So it needs to be more receptive in the way that U.S. courts need to understand that science is evolving and the courts need to as well. That's one of the major suggestions here, is that the courts have to rely much more on science and catch up to where science is available, and that they allow that information to come in even when it was not available at the time, because that's what happens too. A lot of times these cases are decided and then new technology, new science is available that could inform the case. So the courts need to be a little bit more receptive to science.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very true, but it's also important to point out that not all science is created equal, because then you have junk science. And so not only do courts need to accept the science, they need to keep with strict standards of reliability and validity to make sure that the right kind of sciences are getting in.
I couldn't agree with you more. Just the allowance that science can change.
Yes.
Are there any other suggestions that you have in cases of no crime wrongful convictions, things that you might teach?
I think a lot of times it's a lot of the same issues that you see in wrong person wrongful convictions. So all the reforms we talk about with reforming lineup procedures, you don't see that as much in these cases, because it's a no crime case is typically a loved one, but it's not always a loved one. So, the way we interrogate people, Brady violations, all of the safeguards that we see, of course, can be relevant. But I think tunnel vision and confirmation bias are the most important. And that kind of goes into what you were saying, when something seems senseless or too random to just have happened by chance, we look for an explanation. But sometimes there just is no explanation. They say like lightning doesn't strike twice, right? But sometimes it does. It struck 4 times in this family's, in this example, in this case. So I think sometimes it's important to recognize that there could be these tragedies that are just random.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, so corroborating evidence is very important too.
Mhm.
Not convicting someone on just the diary entries. And,
Mhm.
there was such a lack of other corroborating evidence in this case.
I've also heard a suggestion for a double-blind investigation. Have you heard that as well?
Yeah, because that eliminates tunnel vision. And basically that means that, people come in, it's almost like having a third party come in to review the evidence without having the blinders on of already knowing who the suspect is or knowing what the most popular theory is.
I love
'Cause
that
again,
suggestion. I think
yeah.
that's a great one.
The problem is the resources.
Yeah,
It's a
I
lot
know.
of resources.
Yep.
And in a system that's already strained, it's difficult.
It certainly is, but it's necessary.
Yes, I agree.
We always talk about reallocating resources.
Yeah.
It's necessary.
Mhm.
I think these are some of the steps. And of course, there are other steps as well that we haven't covered today. But also, I think one of the important things is, like I said in the beginning, this was such a hard case for me to cover as a new mother. It truly pained me. But I realized it's so important that we tell Kathleen's story.
Yeah.
This is how everyone is aware now of, or the public is aware of wrongful convictions and no crime
Yes.
because we share these stories. They're hard, but her conviction, her exoneration, none of it should be in vain. So
No.
we hope that sharing this story inspires our listeners as well as it inspires ourselves, I think, to do more and become involved.
And as we always say, all of our listeners are potential jurors. So if this case can stick with someone who's potentially on a jury in a similar case, then it could help you realize that these things do happen.
Well put, Amy. Couldn't have said it better.
Thank you for taking this case on. This is a really tough one. And I'm glad you finally were able to do it.
I am too. I really am. And I sincerely wish Kathleen the best of luck and peace in her new life. I hope that others will find inspiration in this story. And again, a big thank you to Siobhhann for forcing my hand on this one. I'm glad you did. I really look forward to discussing it with you and our other supporters at our next meetup. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include the ABC documentary Fighting for Freedom, abcnews.com, CNN.com, The National, University of Newcastle News, and the National Library of Medicine.